The winter wind whistled between the towering skyscrapers of New York City as Alexander Chen stood at his office window on the 45th floor. His reflection stared back at him, successful, wealthy, yet somehow incomplete. At 38, he had built his tech company from the ground up, turning a small startup into a billion-dollar empire. But success felt hollow in his empty penthouse apartment. 3 years had passed since he lost his wife in a car accident. The doctors had told them just weeks before that they couldn't have children naturally. They had been researching surrogacy options together, but fate had other plans. Now, he found himself back on that same path, but alone this time. Every morning, he watched the city wake up from his office window. The same cars, the same busy people rushing to work, the same hot dog vendor at the corner. But today was different. His eyes kept drifting to the building's entrance, where a young woman had been seeking shelter for the past few weeks. Something about her was different from others he'd seen on the streets. She kept herself clean, always had a book in her hands, and helped the elderly cross the busy intersection. His security team had suggested calling the police several times, but he had always declined. That morning, as snowflakes started falling, he watched her share her only blanket with a stray dog. The simple act of kindness made him pause his morning coffee routine. Instead of starting his usual video conference, he grabbed his coat and headed downstairs. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked, approaching her carefully with 2 cups from the building's cafe. "It's freezing out here." She looked up from her worn paperback copy of The Alchemist, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting the cup with gloved hands that had holes in the fingertips. Her name was Rebecca, she told him, and until 6 months ago, she had been a registered nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. As they talked, Alexander learned how quickly life could change. Rebecca's story wasn't the typical tale of addiction or misfortune he'd expected. A series of events had snowballed: her mother's cancer diagnosis, the mounting medical bills, the choice between paying rent or funding life-saving treatment. She'd chosen her mother, and here she was. "I still volunteer at the free clinic on Thursdays," she said proudly, warming her hands on the coffee cup. "Just because I lost my home doesn't mean I lost my purpose." Alexander felt something shift inside him as he listened. Here was someone who had lost everything yet still found ways to help others. The wheels in his mind started turning. He'd interviewed countless potential surrogates through exclusive agencies, all of them feeling somehow wrong. Yet here, in the most unexpected place. "I have an unusual proposition for you," he said carefully, watching her expression. "Would you be willing to come up to my office and talk about it? No strings attached, just a conversation." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, her street-learned caution visible in her eyes. "Let me guess, you're going to offer to help me in exchange for something?" "Yes and no," he replied honestly. "I'm offering a chance to help each other, but it's complicated, and probably a little crazy." She looked at her empty coffee cup, then at the darkening sky threatening more snow. "You know what? After everything I've been through, crazy doesn't scare me anymore." As they walked toward the building's entrance, neither realized they were about to embark on a journey that would change both their lives forever. The security guard's shocked expression as Alexander escorted Rebecca to the private elevator was just the first of many surprise faces they would encounter along the way. Little did they know, this unlikely encounter on a cold winter morning would spark a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and what really makes a family. The elevator ride to the 45th floor felt surreal to Rebecca. Her reflection in the polished brass walls showed just how out of place she looked: worn coat, faded jeans, and scuffed boots beside Alexander's immaculate suit. Yet his gentle demeanor kept her anxiety at bay. His office was larger than the entire apartment she'd once called home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city she usually saw from ground level. A photo on his desk caught her eye, a smiling woman with kind eyes, holding a just married sign. "That was Catherine," Alexander said softly, following her gaze. "We lost her 3 years ago." He gestured toward a comfortable chair. "Please sit. Would you like some tea? Or something to eat?" Rebecca's stomach growled traitorously at the mention of food, and Alexander ordered lunch without waiting for her response. As they waited, he began to explain. "What I'm about to propose might sound crazy," he started, his fingers nervously adjusting his tie. I've spent the last year working with surrogacy agencies trying to find someone to carry my child. Catherine and I, we couldn't have children naturally. We were just starting the surrogacy process when the accident happened. Rebecca's nursing background kicked in. Surrogacy? That's a complex medical and legal process. The screening alone. I know, he nodded. I've been through it all, multiple times, but something always felt wrong. The agencies, the contracts, the clinical nature of it all. He paused as his assistant brought in sandwiches and fruit. Please eat while we talk. Rebecca took a bite of the sandwich, trying to maintain composure despite her hunger. So, what exactly are you suggesting? I want to offer you a chance to change both our lives, he said carefully. I've watched you help others even when you have nothing. You're educated, health-conscious, and despite your circumstances, you've maintained your dignity and compassion. Would you consider being my surrogate? The sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. Excuse me. In exchange, I'll provide everything you need: an apartment, healthcare, living expenses. Enough money to start fresh after. To help your mother too. Rebecca set down her sandwich, her appetite suddenly gone. Let me get this straight. You want to hire a homeless woman to carry your child? Do you realize how insane that sounds? Completely insane, he agreed. My lawyer would have a heart attack. But I trust my instincts in business, and right now, they're telling me this could work. She stood up, pacing the office. You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. A criminal, an addict. But you're not, he said quietly. I had you checked out the first week you appeared outside the building. Rebecca Thompson, Ahn. Perfect record at Mount Sinai. No criminal history. Just someone who chose her family over herself. She stopped pacing, tears threatening to spill. You investigated me? I investigate everyone around my building. Force of habit. But your background only confirmed what I observed. Your kindness, your resilience. Rebecca sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. This is a lot to process. Take time to think about it, Alexander said, sliding a business card across the desk. I've arranged a room for you at the Carlton Hotel. Get warm, rest, think it over. No strings attached. Even if you say no, the room is yours for a week. And if I say yes? Then we do this properly. Medical screening, legal contracts, counseling. Everything by the book. You'd have your own apartment in my building, complete privacy and full medical care. After the baby is born, you'd have enough money to restart your life, plus covered medical care for your mother. Rebecca picked up the business card, running her thumb over the embossed letters. Why me? Really? Alexander walked to the window, looking at the spot where she'd been reading that morning. Because in a world where everyone wants something from me, you shade your only blanket with a stray dog. Sometimes the best decisions don't make sense on paper. She joined him at the window, watching the snow fall. Below, someone else had already taken shelter in her usual spot. I'll think about it. That's all I ask, he said, calling his assistant to escort her to the hotel. As Rebecca followed the assistant out, she glanced back at Alexander. He stood silhouettedly against the window, a lonely figure in a huge office. For the first time, she saw past his wealth to something familiar. The same loneliness she felt every night on the streets. In the hotel room that evening, she stood under her first hot shower in months, letting the water wash away the city's grime. The crazy part wasn't his proposal, she realized. The crazy part was that she was actually considering it. 2 weeks after accepting Alexander's proposal, Rebecca found herself standing in front of a mirror in her new guest house apartment, barely recognizing herself. The woman staring back wore clean clothes, had neatly trimmed hair, and looked healthier already. The guest house, though smaller than the main penthouse, was larger than any place she'd ever lived. The medical screening had been intense but successful. Now came the harder part, their first joint counseling session. It was standard procedure for surrogacy arrangements, but something about sharing her feelings with a stranger made her nervous. Ready to go. Alexander's voice came through the intercom. He'd installed it to give her privacy while keeping communication open. The counselor's office was warm and inviting, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Dr. Wilson, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, smiled warmly at them both. Let's talk about expectations, she began, both emotional and practical. Alexander spoke first, his usual confidence somewhat muted. I want to be involved in the pregnancy, but I don't want to overwhelm Rebecca. It's complicated, finding the right balance. Complicated how? Dr. Wilson prompted. He shifted in his chair. Yesterday, I caught myself bringing her prenatal vitamins and then apologizing for being too controlling. Then I apologized for apologizing. He laughed nervously. I'm not very good at this. Rebecca surprised herself by jumping in. He's actually been wonderful, maybe too wonderful. Sometimes I feel guilty about the fancy apartment and all the care. Like I don't deserve it. Why don't you deserve it? Dr. Wilson asked gently. Rebecca stared at her hands. A few weeks ago, I was sleeping on the street. Now I'm carrying someone's baby in a luxury guest house. It feels like a dream I might wake up from. Tell me about your daily interactions, Dr. Wilson suggested. They glanced at each other, and Alexander spoke first. We'd have breakfast together most mornings. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. Rebecca smiled slightly. He makes terrible coffee. For a rich guy, you'd think he'd know how to use that fancy machine. Henny, I'm learning. Alexander protested, then turned serious. Actually, those breakfasts have become the best part of my day. Rebecca tells me about the books she's reading. She goes through about one a day. Sometimes we talk about the baby, sometimes about nothing important at all. And how does that make you feel? Dr. Wilson asked Rebecca. Safe, she answered without hesitation, not just because of the roof over my head. He listens like he actually cares what I think. Yesterday we spent an hour debating whether pineapple belongs on pizza. It absolutely does not, Alexander interjected, making them all laugh. As the session continued, they discussed deeper fears. Alexander admitted his terror of losing another person he cared about. Rebecca confessed her fear of returning to homelessness after the baby was born. I've set up a trust, Alexander said suddenly. For after, it's not just a lump sum. There's housing, healthcare, education if you want it. I should have told you sooner. Rebecca felt tears threatening. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. You're giving me something priceless. I want you to have a real future. Dr. Wilson watched their interaction thoughtfully. You've both been through significant trauma. Yet instead of closing off, you're choosing to help each other. That's remarkably healthy. After the session, they walked through Central Park, something that had become their routine after appointments. The spring air was crisp, trees just beginning to bud. Thank you, Rebecca said suddenly, stopping by the lake. Not just for the trust for everything. I keep waiting for the catch, but you're just kind. Alexander watched a family of ducks swim by. Catherine used to say I was too guarded, too focused on work. After losing her, I realized she was right. What's the point of all this success if you can't use it to help others? Still, most billionaires don't take in random homeless women as surrogates. Most homeless women don't spend their last dollars on food for stray dogs, he countered. We're both a little strange, I guess. They continued walking, a comfortable silence between them. Rebecca felt the first flutter of movement in her belly, too early to be the baby, just butterflies from their conversation. Yet somehow, these moments of quiet understanding were slowly becoming more important than all the legal agreements and medical procedures. Back at the guest house, Rebecca found a new book on her kitchen counter, Pride and Prejudice, her favorite. A note from Alexander Reed. Saw this first edition at an auction. Thought you might like it. P.S. Tomorrow I'll try not to burn the coffee. She hugged the book to her chest, realizing that somewhere between the counseling sessions and breakfast conversations, the walls they'd built to protect themselves were slowly crumbling away. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming home. 4 months into the pregnancy, everything changed. Rebecca woke up one morning to find spotting, just a little, but enough to send her heart racing. She tried calling Alexander, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He was in an important board meeting, one he'd been preparing for weeks. She didn't want to interrupt, but the doctor had been clear. Any bleeding needed immediate attention. With shaking hands, she texted his assistant, medical issue. Not emergency yet, but need to reach him. Alexander was mid-presentation when his assistant slipped him the note. He read it twice, then did something he'd never done before. He walked out of the board meeting without a word of explanation. 10 minutes later, They were in his private car, racing to the hospital. Rebecca kept apologizing. The meeting was important. I shouldn't have. Stop, he said firmly, holding her hand. Nothing is more important than this. The tender gesture surprised them both, but neither pulled away. In the hospital waiting room, Alexander paced while Rebecca underwent tests. His assistant called repeatedly about the abandoned meeting, but he ignored the calls. Finally, the doctor emerged with news. Everything was okay, but Rebecca needed complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. I can't do that, Rebecca protested. I have my volunteer work at the clinic and… You can and you will, Alexander interrupted. He turned to the doctor. What else does she need? The doctor listed recommendations: reduced stress, regular monitoring, healthy diet, someone nearby at all times. Alexander took notes on his phone, already making plans. That evening, as they drove home, Rebecca was unusually quiet. I've messed everything up, haven't I? Your meeting. The meeting doesn't matter. The company doesn't matter. This, he gestured to her belly, this matters. But the world had other plans. The next morning's business news featured photos of Alexander rushing Rebecca to the hospital. Billionaire's mystery woman, read the headlines. Speculation ran wild. Who was she? Why the urgent hospital visit? His phone exploded with calls from board members and investors. We need to address this, his PR team insisted during an emergency meeting. The company's stock is already affected. Alexander sat in his home office, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Then he heard music drifting from Rebecca's guest house, the classical playlist he'd made for her. Making a decision, he turned to his PR team. No statements, no explanations. My personal life is not up for discussion. But sir, the investors will have to deal with it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to deliver some lunch. He found Rebecca attempting to make her own soup, despite the bed rest orders. What are you doing? I can't just lie around while your life falls apart because of me, she said, stirring the pot stubbornly. Alexander took the spoon from her hand. Back to bed. Doctor's orders. He guided her to the bedroom, then returned to finish making the soup. When he brought it to her, she was crying quietly. Hey, what's wrong? I saw the news, she whispered. Your company's stock dropped. Your reputation. He sat on the edge of her bed. Want to know a secret? I've spent my whole life caring about what others think, building this perfect image. And you know what? It's exhausting. But your work will survive. Actually, he smiled slightly, some of our younger investors think the mystery is intriguing. Our social media engagement is up 200%. That made her laugh through her tears. Then her expression turned serious. Alexander, I need to tell you something. These past months I've started to. A sharp kick from the baby interrupted her. Without thinking, she grabbed his hand and placed it on her belly. They both froze, feeling the strong movement under their joined hands. That's amazing, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. She does that a lot now, especially when she hears your voice. She. Rebecca blushed. Just a feeling I have. They sat there, hands still joined, neither wanting to break the moment. The soup grew cold, phones buzzed ignored, and the outside world faded away. In that quiet moment, they both realized something had shifted between them, something that went far beyond their original agreement. Later that night, Alexander sat in his office, looking at the hospital bill. The cost was nothing to him, but seeing Rebecca's name there, seeing the word complicated pregnancy in black and white, made his chest tight with worry. He found himself doing something he hadn't done since Catherine died. He prayed. In her bed, Rebecca touched the spot where they'd felt the baby kick, remembering the look in Alexander's eyes. The walls between them were crumbling faster now, and it terrified her. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. But then again, the best things in life rarely were. The media storm around Alexander and Rebecca grew stronger as her pregnancy became more visible. Paparazzi camped outside the building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious woman living in the billionaire's guest house. But it wasn't the headlines that changed everything. It was a simple envelope Rebecca found while organizing her medical papers. The envelope contained hospital bills, but not her recent ones. These were dated 6 months ago for her mother's cancer treatments at a private facility. Bills she thought her mother's insurance had mysteriously decided to cover. Bills that matched exactly the amount she'd been desperate to raise when she ended up on the streets. Her hands shook as she read through the documents. Alexander had been paying for her mother's treatment all along, even before he approached her about the surrogacy. The realization hit her like a wave. He'd known about her mother's condition before he ever spoke to her. That evening, when Alexander came for their usual dinner, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread out in front of her. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she asked quietly. He looked at the papers and his face fell. "I was waiting for the right time." "The right time?" Her voice cracked. "You've been paying for my mother's treatment for months. Since before, was this whole surrogacy thing just pity?" Alexander sat down heavily across from her. "No. God, no. Let me explain." "Please do," she said, wrapping her arms protectively around her growing belly. He took a deep breath. "After Catherine died, I was lost. I threw myself into work, avoided anything personal. Then I saw you outside the building. You were reading to that old man who sells newspapers, making him laugh despite the cold. I had you checked out. Standard procedure for anyone around the building. That's when I learned about your mother. So you decided to play hero." "No," he said firmly. "I decided to help anonymously. The surrogacy idea came later, after watching you for weeks. Your kindness, your strength, those were real. The bills, I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid you'd think exactly what you're thinking now." Rebecca stood up, needing to move. "I don't know what to think. Everything feels like a lie." "Not everything," he said softly. "Not the morning talks, not the way you've brought life back into this place. Not the—" he stopped, looking away. "Not the what?" "Not the way I've fallen in love with you," he whispered. The words hung in the air between them. Rebecca felt the baby kick, as if responding to the tension in the room. "You can't," she said, tears starting to fall. "This isn't a fairy tale. I'm carrying your baby as part of a contract." "A contract that's become meaningless." He stood up, moving closer. "Do you think I care about any of that anymore? These past months, watching you fight through morning sickness with a smile, seeing you read stories to my unborn child, hearing you laugh at my terrible jokes, I've fallen in love with who you are, not what you're doing for me. Your board of directors already hate me for putting the company second. Let them. I've spent my whole life building wealth, but you've shown me what real value is." Rebecca touched her belly, feeling the strong kicks. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Everything's so complicated now." "Then let's make it simple," he said, taking her hand. "I love you. The baby, the company, the contract, those are all details. What matters is this right here. Us. But my mother's bills. We're only trying to help someone in need, nothing more. I help dozens of people through my foundation. You're not a charity case, Rebecca. You're the woman I love." She looked at their joined hands, remembering all the small moments that had led to this one. The burnt coffee he made every morning, just so they could share breakfast. The way he remembered every detail of the books she talked about. How he dropped everything, risked everything, when she needed him at the hospital. "I think," she said slowly, "I've been falling in love with you too. And it terrifies me." He pulled her gently into his arms, careful of her belly. "Could kind of terrifying." She nodded against his chest. "But what happens now?" "The media, your investors. Now we face everything together," he said simply. "No more secrets, no more pretending this is just a business arrangement. If the world wants to talk, let them talk. I'm tired of hiding what matters." The baby kicked again, strong enough for them both to feel it. They laughed, the tension breaking. "She agrees," Rebecca smiled through her tears. "She." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You're still sure it's a girl?" "Mother's intuition." He kissed her forehead softly. Mother's intuition has been right about a lot of things lately. Outside, the city buzzed with speculation about them. Inside, in the quiet of the kitchen, they'd finally found their truth. Sometimes love grows in the strangest circumstances between the most unexpected people. And sometimes, what starts as a business arrangement ends up being the best mistake two people ever made. The emergency call came during the most important board meeting of Alexander's career. His company was facing a crucial merger, and the board members had gathered to make their final decision. But when his phone lit up with Rebecca's number, he didn't hesitate. "She's in labor," her friend from the free clinic said quickly. 2 months early, we're heading to Mount Sinai. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander stood up. I have to go, he said simply. You can't leave now, one of the directors protested. This merger could double our company's value. Alexander looked at the faces around the table, people he'd known for years, people who'd helped build his empire. Then he thought of Rebecca, alone and scared at the hospital. Some things are worth more than money, he said, already moving toward the door. Vote however you want. I choose my family. The drive to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of his life. When he arrived, he found Rebecca already in the delivery room, her face pale with worry. The baby's coming too early, she whispered as he took her hand. I'm sorry, I tried to. Don't apologize, he said firmly. You've been amazing. Both of you are going to be fine. The doctors moved quickly, explaining the risks of premature birth. They wanted to do an emergency C-section. Rebecca squeezed Alexander's hand so tight it hurt, but he didn't care. I'm scared, she admitted quietly, so only he could hear. Remember what you told me about fear, he said softly. That night we talked about your time on the streets. You said being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. She managed a small smile, even through her pain. You actually listened to all my late-night rambling. I listened to everything, still do, and I'll be right here, listening, holding your hand for as long as you'll let me. The next few hours were a blur of medical terms, worried faces, and quiet prayers. Alexander never left her side, even when the nurses suggested he wait outside. He whispered encouragement, wiped her forehead, and held her hand through every contraction. His phone buzzed constantly. The board meeting had ended. The merger was in jeopardy. Reporters were gathering outside the hospital. He ignored it all, focused only on Rebecca's breathing and the steady beep of monitors. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, their daughter arrived. She was tiny, smaller than she should have been, but her cry was strong. The medical team worked quickly, checking her breathing, her responses. She's a fighter, the doctor said with a smile. Like her mother. They placed the baby in an incubator, but let Rebecca touch her tiny hand through the opening. Alexander watched them both, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. She's perfect, he whispered. Rebecca looked up at him, tears in her eyes. What happened at the board meeting? Doesn't matter. Alexander. Really, it doesn't. I made my choice, and I'd make it again. 1,000 times over. A nurse came in with forms to fill out. Name for the baby? They hadn't discussed names. It hadn't seemed right before, when everything was just a contract. But now Rebecca spoke softly. Hope. Her name is Hope. Alexander felt tears in his own eyes. Hope, he repeated. It's perfect. Later that night, as Rebecca slept and their daughter fought her first battles in the ICU, Alexander sat in the hospital corridor. His assistant finally reached in with news. The board had voted against the merger, citing concerns about his commitment to the company. He should have been devastated. Years of work, billions in potential profit, gone in a single day. Instead, he felt strangely peaceful. He looked through the nursery window at his tiny daughter, watching her little chest rise and fall. Worth it, he whispered to himself. A doctor approached with updates. Hope was doing well, her breathing getting stronger. Rebecca was recovering normally. They could both go home in a few weeks if everything continued to improve. Home. The word had a different meaning now. It wasn't his empty penthouse or Rebecca's guest house. Home was wherever the three of them would be together. His phone buzzed again, this time with a surprising message. The story of him leaving the board meeting for the birth had leaked. But instead of the expected backlash, social media was flooded with support. Billionaire chooses family over fortune was trending. He showed the messages to Rebecca when she woke up. She read them through tired eyes, then looked at him seriously. Are you sure about all this? About us? Instead of answering, he pulled a small box from his pocket, one he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving it. Rebecca looked at the ring, then at Hope sleeping peacefully in her incubator, then back at Alexander. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times over. Outside the hospital, reporters waited for statements and photographers angled for shots. Inside, in a quiet room with beeping monitors and new life, two people who found love in the most unexpected way held hands and watched their daughter breathe, knowing that sometimes the best decisions are the ones your heart makes for you. 6 months after Hope's dramatic arrival, the garden of Alexander's Hampton estate was transformed into a fairy tale. White roses climbed archways, and soft music played as guests gathered for what the media had dubbed the wedding of the year. But the real story wasn't in the decorations or the celebrity guests, it was in the tiny details that made it uniquely theirs. The wedding cake was made by the same bakery where Rebecca used to buy day-old bread to feed the homeless. The old newspaper seller she used to read to was given a place of honor in the front row. And their daughter Hope, now healthy and strong, wore a tiny dress that matched her mother's. "You're sure about this?" Rebecca's mother asked as she helped her daughter with the veil. Thanks to her successful treatment, she was strong enough to walk Rebecca down the aisle. Rebecca looked at herself in the mirror, remembering the woman who had once slept in doorways. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Instead of traditional vows, they chose to tell their story, the real story, in front of everyone. Alexander went first. "A year ago, I thought I had everything figured out. Success meant numbers in a bank account and headlines in financial papers. Then I met a woman who had nothing but gave everything. She taught me that real wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Today, I'm not just gaining a wife, I'm gaining the family I never thought I'd have." Rebecca's voice shook slightly as she spoke. "Life has a funny way of surprising you. When I was at my lowest point, sleeping on the streets, I still believed in helping others. What I never expected was that by holding on to that belief, I would find someone who would help me believe in love again. Today, I'm not just gaining a husband. I'm gaining proof that fairy tales can come true in the most unexpected ways." As they exchanged rings, Hope let out a happy gurgle from her grandmother's arms, making everyone laugh. The moment was perfect, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. At the reception, Alexander surprised everyone by announcing the launch of their new foundation. The Hope Initiative, he explained, will focus on helping people who've fallen on hard times due to medical bills, because everyone deserves a second chance at their dreams. Rebecca added her own surprise. She'd completed her nursing recertification and would be heading the foundation's medical program. The guests applauded, but Alexander looked at her with tears in his eyes, knowing how hard she'd studied for this while caring for their daughter. Later that evening, as they swayed to their first dance, Rebecca whispered, "Did you ever imagine this when you first saw me outside your building?" "Never," he admitted. "I thought I was just helping someone in need. Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for." The party continued into the night, but the most beautiful moment came after most guests had left. Rebecca found Alexander in the nursery, holding Hope and telling her their story. "And that's how Mommy saved Daddy," he was saying softly. "By showing him that sometimes the best things in life can't be bought or sold. They have to be felt, right here." He pointed to his heart. Rebecca joined them, wrapping her arms around both her husband and daughter. "And how did Daddy save Mommy?" Hope asked sleepily, using the baby sign language they'd been teaching her. "By believing in her," Rebecca answered, even when she didn't believe in herself. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, they sat in their favorite spot, the kitchen, sharing slightly burnt coffee and planning their future. The newspapers would run stories about the billionaire's fairy tale wedding, but they knew the real story was simpler and more beautiful than any headline could capture. It was about how love could grow in the most unlikely places, between the most unexpected people. How sometimes the greatest act of charity is simply believing in someone. And how a baby girl named Hope had brought truth to her name, giving hope not just to her parents, but to countless others through the foundation that would bear her name. "Ready for our next adventure?" Alexander asked, passing Rebecca her coffee. She looked at their daughter playing with her breakfast, then at the man who had changed her life in ways she never expected. "With you too? Always." Outside, the world continued to turn. The company's stock had recovered, the media had found new stories to tell, and life moved forward. But in that kitchen, with burnt coffee and baby giggles, they had found something better than success or headlines. They had found home, and it was more beautiful than any fairy tale could have imagined.